Unless you've been living under some sort of Iranian-backed rock, you probably are aware of who the Mossad are. They are essentially the Israelis' CIA or MI6, but they have become notorious over the years for all of their clandestine operations, run-in with various countries, hunting Nazis, to their recent operation with pagers in Operation Grim Beeper. But perhaps the craziest thing that the Mossad are linked to is the recent rumours and ongoing rumours that they were the handlers of Jeffrey Epstein. But is there any truth to it, and how did this notorious agency even begin? We're going to cover all of that and more in this week's episode of The Jason Hassett Show. I am, as you can imagine, Jason Hassett, and this is the entire history of the Mossad.
Do it live!
I am not going to exploit.
A Pizza Express in Woking.
Your line of questioning is transphobic.
Now watch this drive.
Fucking thing sucks!
Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of The Jason Hassett Show. And as you probably saw from the intro as well as the title and thumbnail, we're going to be covering an intelligence agency today, which means we'll all but definitely be banned, demonetized, and, just silently go into the ether by next week, especially because we're also going to be talking about the alleged links to Epstein. Of course, we're going to go through this as we always do in the Jason Hassett Show, where I have gotten some research from the interwebs, which is famously unreliable, and go through it with you fine people here. So as always, I ask that if you think something is wrong here, or if I've missed something you find intriguing, head down to the comments and let us know, because this is a learning experience for us all. And while you're down there, why not hit the old like and subscribe buttons, because that helps me get some of that delicious cash and hopefully a defense attorney. So I'm really excited about this one for a couple of reasons. First of which is that when it comes to intelligence agencies, I think Mossad is the one I know the least about. I have a good idea of the CIA's foundations, MI6, all of these different things. But Mossad I've never really looked into in a big way, apart from maybe The Hunt for Eichmann, the movie that covered that, those kind of things. But yeah, this is going to be an interesting one where I'm going to be learning very much along with you guys. So I'm very much excited for this. And also, you may have noticed some of the eagle-eyed of you, the camp t-shirt I'm wearing. Big shout out to Camp Gagnon. Absolutely love that channel. If you haven't checked it out, I do work with those guys. But yeah, Mark is a legend and I love them. And that has very much inspired me to start this channel. With that said, let's jump into the entire history of the Mossad, and then we can look at the rumors, links, allegations to Epstein at the end as well, and see what we think of it and let you guys decide from the facts that are known and so on what you think. So Mossad, or in Hebrew, which is going to be interesting for me to try and pronounce, is Hamasad le Mojin ul Takfidim Mayuchadim, or in plain English, the Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, known as Mossad. It's the Israeli National Intelligence Agency, which I'm sure you're all aware of, was formally established in 1949. And it's tasked with foreign intelligence collection, covert operations, and counterterrorism, answering directly to the Prime Minister of the country. From its inception through the decades, the Mossad has built a formidable reputation through daring missions, from hunting Nazis to criminals to high-staked, quote-unquote, alleged assassinations, or just outright assassinations, as we'll probably get into, while also encountering notable failures and controversies. So that's kind of a high-level version of what the Mossad is. For anyone who didn't know, I'm guessing you all did from clicking this episode. But now we're going to go into where it began, right the way through. So we kick off at the very, very start to right before Israel is even a country at this point. So even before Israel's independence, Jewish paramilitary groups had rudimentary intelligence arms, such as the Haganah Shai unit, which was founded in 1929 under the British mandate to gather information and assist clandestine immigration. So that's where it kind of all kicked off from pre-World War II. But after Israel's establishment in 1948 as its own country, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion sought to centralize intelligence work. And on December 13th, 1949, the Mossad was officially formed although it was then named the CIC, or Central Institute for Coordination, which was placed under Reuven Shalohi. And forgive all of my pronunciations in this. As you may have guessed, I don't speak Hebrew, and a lot of these names, I'm guessing, are Hebrew in origin, or at least Arabic in origin. So going to be difficult for me, but bear with me. Shalawi put this together, this Central Intelligence Agency of Israel, to coordinate military intelligence, which was known as Aman, internal security, Shin Bet, and the Foreign Office's Intelligence Unit, all into one place. In 1951, it was reorganized under the Prime Minister's office to keep it out of the Knesset, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which is essentially Israel's parliament or Congress for the Americans in the audience. And this later led journalist Ronan Bergman to describe the Mossad as a deep state apparatus within Israel, which kind of makes sense given that it's very much outside of congressional or parliamentary oversight. Which I think to an extent you could say the CIA is. I know their funding isn't, but I guess for most part, like a lot of it's kept out of the watchful eye of Congress. So it's kind of normal to an extent to make sure that congressional leaders aren't looking at like really top secret details. But anyway, it's a discussion for a different time. In its first years, the nascent Mossad focused on building spy networks and assisting Israel's strategic interests amid regional hostilities. Remember, around this time, obviously, Israel is a newfound state. Obviously, British Palestine, and we'll get into all the history of this in a different episode, but, Israel had been given its own state by the British, who owned British Palestine at the time. This uprooted 750,000 Palestinians from the area, essentially, if my history is to be believed. And uprooted them into surrounding states, Jordan, Egypt, and so on. And obviously this upset the Arab states at the time for uprooting another Arab nation. So the Mossad was very much focused on helping gather intelligence for wars that were already kicking off or would kick off and so on. If there's one thing that intelligence agencies hate, it's people watching them while they're watching you. Whether you're looking up Cold War operations, deep diving into the Mossad, or just researching rumors you're definitely not supposed to know about, you need NordVPN. It's like a cloaking device for your browser, encrypting your data and masking your IP and keeping your curiosity off the radar. Head to nordvpn.com/Hassett right now for a limited 77% off a 2-year deal plus 4 months free. And all of this with a 30-day money-back guarantee, because in a world full of watchers, it's a good idea to make sure someone is watching your back. Now back to the episode. One early embarrassment for the Israeli intelligence agency, though involving a military intel unit rather than Mossad directly, was the 1954 Lavon affair. In that covert operation, Israeli military intelligence agents in Egypt recruited local Jews to plant bombs at American and British sites to destabilize Egypt. The plot was exposed, several agents were caught or even hanged, and the Israeli defense minister was forced to resign. The fiasco was obviously not a good look. And to be fair to the Mossad agency, the CIA, MI6 had their own fiascos early on in their history as well, which caused them to be much more secretive about what they're doing. But yeah, this was a big thing that caused a shakeup in Israel's intelligence community. But by the late 1950s, the intelligence agency would begin to score a lot of successes as well. For example, they obtained Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin in 1956 through a Polish source and shared it with the West. This bolstered Israel's standing with the CIA and gave them a much tighter link to that group going forward, which has famously stayed very strong over the years. Although, from what I hear, and I think Mike Baker talked about this recently, there's kind of a weird alliance between the CIA and Mossad in that they're both kind of competing with each other while working with each other. And there's kind of this unease between the two at points, but they do work together quite closely. During this period, Mossad also laid groundwork for global operations and cultivated ties with friendly agencies, notably forming a close relationship with Iran's Savak in the late 1950s. So in the 1960s is when we get into the time that was very famous in history and famous for the Mossad, and very much what we think of with the Mossad. Until, I guess, lately, when it's maybe seen as, a bit more of a nefarious organization. But this was a defining early time for the Mossad when they decided to go on hunt for Holocaust perpetrators who had fled Europe. And in 1960, Mossad agents located Adolf Eichmann, who was the architect famously of the Nazis' final solution, and they found him hiding in Argentina under an alias. A Mossad team covertly surveilled him and then abducted Eichmann in 1960 on May 11th, smuggling him to Israel to stand trial. This was a very, very difficult mission because he had essentially protection of Argentina. Argentina was very much allowing former Nazis to live there. They had brought over immense wealth, allegedly, and that's why. But Eichmann's capture and subsequent 1962 execution was a dramatic victory for Mossad and brought Holocaust crimes into global focus. However, as I mentioned, this caused a massive diplomatic snafu. Argentina protested Israel's violation of its sovereignty, and the UN Security Council issued a mild censure of such acts while affirming the desire to see Eichmann brought to justice. Emboldened by Eichmann's capture, Mossad considered targeting Mengele, the infamous Auschwitz doctor, which I guess we could cover as well if you want to. I guess there's a lot of I don't want to get too deep into Nazi stuff, but I think, the Nazi history is interesting, so something to get into maybe. But they ultimately abandoned their plans to kidnap Mengele, who eluded capture and died in exile years later. Mossad did eliminate other Nazi fugitives. In 1965, for example, in South America, they assassinated Herbert Kukurs, a Latvian ex-Nazi collaborator known as the Butcher of Riga. They also pursued Ally Brune, who was Eichmann's deputy, but this didn't go so well. In 1963, a Mossad mail bomb aimed at Brunner killed an unintended victim, and a later parcel bomb in 1980 blew off Brunner's fingers, injuring but not killing him. So that operation didn't go great. These operations, though, did demonstrate Mossad's post-war resolve to kind of exact justice or vengeance for Nazi criminals, even though a lot of these missions didn't exactly go to fair. In the early 1960s, Israel grew alarmed that ex-Nazi scientists were aiding Egypt's missile program, seen as an existential threat, which I assume means we're going to see them hunting down NASA later as well for paperclip. No, maybe not. Let's see. Mossad launched Operation Damocles, an intimidation campaign to scare these scientists into stopping their work. Tactics included anonymous threats, parcel bombs, and abductions. And in September 1962, for instance, a German rocket scientist, Dr. Heinz Krug, mysteriously vanished in Munich. It later emerged he was killed as part of a Mossad plot to deter Egypt's projects, which is insane. In a twist, Mossad even recruited former Waffen-SS commando Otto Skorzeny, a one-time favorite of Hitler, to help in this mission. Skorzeny himself reportedly carried out Krug's assassination for Israel. The campaign exposure caused scandal, and in 1963, Swiss police arrested 2 Mossad operatives after one scientist's daughter was threatened, and this caused a big political blowback against the Mossad. The fallout contributed to the resignation of Mossad's legendary director, Isser Harel, in 1963. Harel had led the Mossad since 1952 and oversaw the Eichmann capture, and he was succeeded by Meir Amit. Despite controversy, Operation Damocles did succeed in frightening many German scientists away from Egypt's program. The 1960s very much emboldened Mossad, and it decided to launch its tentacles worldwide and start feeling around in other global affairs and extending its reach very, very similarly to what the CIA did around this time. It established stations in Europe, forged alliance with Western and friendly intelligence agencies, and also undertook realpolitik missions at the behest of allied regimes. For instance, in 1965, Mossad reportedly assisted Morocco's intelligence security service in the abduction of dissident Mehdi Ben Barka in Paris, a still murky affair that tarnished France's relations with both Morocco and Israel. In 1967, on the eve of the Six-Day War, 2 Mossad agents were caught in West Germany while breaking into the home of a former Gestapo officer, presumably as part of its ongoing Nazi tracking affairs. These guys, though, were quietly released by the German authorities as a goodwill gesture after Israel's victory in the 1967 war. Within Israel's neighborhood, one of Mossad's notable exploits was running an extraordinary spy in Syria. So Eli Cohen spoke fluent Arabic and was famous in the Mossad. This is one of their most famous stories because in the 1960s, he infiltrated the highest levels of the Syrian government. Under the alias Kaman Amil Tabet, Cohen befriended Syria's political military elite, even being considered for the post of defense minister of the entire country, and transmitted valuable intelligence to Israel. He mapped Syrian defenses in the Golan Heights and even influenced them, famously suggesting trees be planted at army fortifications, which later served as markers for Israeli artillery, which is just insane. Cohen was eventually discovered by Syrian counterintelligence and executed in 1965, but his information proved crucial to Israel's swift victory in 1967. All of this meant that by the end of the 1960s, essentially, the Mossad was one of the most notorious and one of the most well-organized intelligence agencies in the world. And they were only, in reality, getting started. The 1970s, though, would see Mossad very much thrusted into the public eye. After 11 Israeli athletes were massacred by the Black September terror group at the Munich Olympics in 1972, Prime Minister Golda Meir authorized the Mossad to track down and assassinate those responsible. Codenamed Operation Wrath of God, or Bayonet, the campaign spanned years and just countless countries. Mossad's team killed the suspected Black September or PLO operatives across Europe, bombing or shooting operatives in Rome, Paris, Nicosia, Athens, and Beirut as retribution for Munich. However, this retaliatory sweep was imperfect. Some targets had tenuous links to the Munich attack, and innocent people were caught in the crossfires. The most notorious blunders came in July of 1973 with the Lillehammer affair in Norway. They mistook a Moroccan-born waiter, Ahmed Bouchiki, for a fugitive Palestinian militant. Mossad agents shot and killed him in Lillehammer. Norwegian authorities arrested 5 members of the hit team, and Israel eventually quietly secured their releases, but not before a public trial and diplomatic humiliation. Israel had to pay compensation to Bouchiki's family, and the fiasco forced Mossad to completely suspend the operation. The Wrath of God campaign did catch some of the people involved in this kind of notorious affair, some of these notorious militants, and most prominently Ali Hassan Salameh was killed in a car bomb in Beirut in 1979, but it did draw massive criticism for the agency. But not all of the 1970s affairs were revenge killings. Some were daring rescue or sabotage missions that became the stuff of legend. One notable example was in 1976 in Uganda, when Palestinian and German terrorists hijacked an Air France flight to Entebbe in Uganda, which I'm definitely pronouncing wrong. The Mossad played a vital intelligence role in the rescue. Mossad agents gathered information on the Ugandan layout and even covertly obtained detailed plans of Entebbe airport, which enabled Israeli commandos to execute the famous July 4th, 1976 long-range hostage rescue plan. This freed 100 hostages and dealt a huge blow to international terrorism. And also a few years earlier, technically still in the 60s, but we didn't mention it, in 1969, Mossad had also pulled off an audacious caper known as the Cherbourg Project, where they managed to smuggle 5 state-of-the-art missile boats out of a French harbour after a French arms embargo, effectively stealing its own boats that had been paid for but embargoed. Mossad also continued clandestine support to allies and proxies, and for decades it had aided groups like the Kurds in Iraq, and in the 1970s it backed Christian militias in Lebanon. This was part of a strategy of essentially arming the enemies of Israel's enemies. Some of these efforts did backfire though, like later on in Lebanon, where Israel's interventions in 1982 led to atrocities and a protracted war. Despite the focus, though, on counterterrorism, Mossad's core espionage work remained critical in this era. In 1973, a Mossad source famously warned of the impending joint Egyptian-Syrian attack shortly before the Yom Kippur War broke out. This came as a tip from an Egyptian informant who was later revealed to be President Sadat's son-in-law, Ashraf Marwan, and it came just hours before the hostilities. This last-minute warning, while not enough to prevent Israel from being caught off guard, did allow for some mobilization. The surprise of the 1973 war was later deemed as an intelligence failure at a strategic level, and it sparked many internal reviews. Before we leave the 70s, though, I've just realized there's one piece that we had forgotten to talk about, which was that in 1966, there was a famous operation called Operation Diamond. And this is where basically Mossad convinced an Iraqi Air Force pilot to fly his brand new Soviet-made MiG-21 fighter jet into Israel and delivered a cutting-edge MiG to Western hands, providing just crazy intelligence-level information to the West. It's that kind of thing that made sure that Mossad constantly had the backing of Western intelligence agencies, namely CIA and MI6. But finally, towards the end of the decade in 1979, Mossad also quietly helped facilitate Egypt-Israel peace feelers by acting as an unofficial back channel to Cairo, an intelligence-to-intelligence diplomacy that laid the groundwork for the 1979 Camp David Accord. The 1980s very much saw Israel's determination to preempt, threats from other countries go onto high alert. Obviously, after the war in the 1970s that they had failed to catch, this was very much a focus for them going forward. One high priority target in the 80s was Iraqi's nuclear program under Saddam Hussein. Mossad had already infiltrated the program by recruiting an Iraqi nuclear scientist in France in the late 1970s, which was codenamed Operation Sphinx. This yielded detailed plans of the Osirak reactor. And the intelligence paved the way for Israel's dramatic June 1981 airstrike called Operation Opera, which destroyed the Osirak reactor and set Iraqi's nuclear ambitions way back. Mossad also acted in unorthodox ways to counter weapons proliferations. For example, in the 1980s, it allegedly ran a fake diving resort on Sudan's Red Sea coast as a cover to smuggle thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. An operation later publicized in the film Red Sea Diving Resort. Posing as seafront hotel operators, Mossad agents used this front between 1980 and 1985 to exfiltrate members of the Beta Israel community from Sudan to Israel, saving them from famine and persecution. You might wonder what the benefit of this was, but essentially this was to kind of give them like a humanitarian appeal to the wider world and make them not look as just this kind of seedy covert operation. In 1988, Mossad is believed to have assisted the IDF in assassinating PLO military chief Khalil Az-Wazir or Abu Jihad in Tunis, and in 1985, a joint Mossad-CIA operation lured top Palestinian hijacker Fawaz Yunus onto a yacht in the Mediterranean under the pretense of a drug deal and kidnapped him, handing him over to the FBI for extradition to the US, which again was just showing that the Mossad really wanted to back up its cooperation with the CIA to ensure that it had its intelligence web everywhere. Of course, none of this goes without embarrassment, as always is the case when it comes to these intelligence agencies. For example, in 1985, Jonathan Pollard, a US Navy intelligence officer, was arrested for spying on the United States on Israel's behalf. Pollard had passed United States military documents that were classified to Lacham, a scientific intelligence unit separate from the Mossad, working under the IDF. The incident caused a serious rift with Washington. Israel initially denied complicity, but then apologized and dismantled Lacham to placate the US. Pollard was sentenced to life in prison in the US. He would ultimately be paroled in 2015. But this was one case where Israelis' aggressive nature with the Mossad really backfired against its closest ally. A couple of years later, though, in 1987, it was Britain who lodged a formal protest to Israel after discovering Israeli operatives had forged UK passports. And they had done this for clandestine use. Israel assured Britain such misuse of friendly passports would cease and never happen again. A promise that later events would show was not fully kept. Let's put it that way. Also, in the late 80s, Israel's domestic spy agency Shin Bet would become embroiled in the Bus 300 affair, covering up the execution of Palestinian hijackers, which, while not a Mossad operation, further strained public trust in their intelligence institutions. The Mossad's long reach continued to be felt during the 80s, though. For example, in 1986, Mossad ran a classic honeypot trap to catch Mordecai Vanunu, a former Israeli nuclear technician who had leaked nuclear secrets to the British press. A female Mossad agent enticed Vanunu in London, who was then whisked to Rome and abducted, where he was shipped back to Israel to face his trial for treason. Vanunu's kidnapping on foreign soil, much like Eichmann's decades earlier, drew massive international criticism. But Israel defended it vehemently on national security grounds and said, let's be honest here, Vanunu has an objectively funny surname, and therefore we should Vanunu the no-no and Nanunu. That was terrible. But it wasn't all bad. In February of 1988, Mossad agents in Cyprus uncovered a plot to bomb an Israeli embassy and managed to capture 3 PLO operatives before they were able to do this with explosives. Towards the end of the 80s is when Mossad would very much start to pivot its attention and focus on Islamic threats, mainly Iran, and start to put a lot of attention and emphasis on basically looking into terror groups, mainly Iranian-backed ones. In 1988, for example, a car bomb killed the Hezbollah's military chief's brother in Beirut, a likely Mossad message to the military chief Mughniyeh himself, who was responsible for horrific attacks like the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. Mughniyeh, though, managed to survive several Israeli kind of attacks on him directly until much later, but we'll talk about that later on. Meanwhile, Mossad and IDF also provided clandestine support to South Lebanon's Christian militias throughout this time and gathered intel on Hezbollah during Israel's occupation of South Lebanon from 1982 to 2000. The 1990s were an interesting time for the Mossad as peace started to flow through the world. Obviously, the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Middle East started to calm down, given that a lot of the countries in the Middle East who had been spiking things no longer had backing from the Russians. With the Cold War ending and the Middle East peace process underway, the Mossad in the 1990s had to recalibrate. It focused on emerging threats like Islamic terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In 1990, though, as Iraq invaded Kuwait and the Gulf War loomed, Mossad helped facilitate Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union and Ethiopia, resuming covert airlifts in Sudan, for example, under Operation Solomon in 1991. Mossad also continued helping thwart arms to Israelis' enemies. For instance, in 1992, Israelis' agents in Europe obtained intelligence on Iran's nuclear ambitions and assisted in sabotaging Iranian-bound shipments of dual-use technology. An interesting note, though, is that they did have some hand in diplomacy as well. For example, Mossad had a behind-the-scenes role in early contacts with the PLO that led to the Oslo Accords of 1993. Mossad's chief, Shabtai Shavit, maintained secret channels to certain Arab leaders at the time, and Mossad facilitated some of the clandestine meetings between Israeli and PLO representatives in the run-up to Oslo. Once the peace process began, however, Hamas and Islamic Jihad stepped up terror attacks, and the Mossad inevitably shifted its focus to targeting those militant leaders abroad. The 1990s, though, also saw some headlining hits attributed to the Mossad. In October of 1995, Mossad agents assassinated Dr. Fatih Shikaki, the leader of the Islamic Jihad, shooting him outside his hotel in Malta. In January of 1996, Mossad famously, reputedly at least, sent a booby-trapped book to Yahya Ayyash, who was Hamas's infamous bomb maker, the engineer, killing him in Gaza, though some credit Shin Bet for that. And these eliminations were aimed at disrupting the wave of suicide bombings plaguing Israel during the mid-1990s. And while all of this gave Mossad this air of being absolutely on top of things, the 90s also had some of Mossad's most notorious embarrassments and failures throughout the decade. In 1996, a team of Mossad in Switzerland attempted to tap the phone of a Hezbollah operative, but they were caught by Swiss authorities. One agent, allegedly Mossad, was convicted and fined in a closed trial, and worse was the 1997 fiasco in Jordan. Mossad agents in Amman tried to assassinate Hamas's political leader, Khaled Mashal, by spraying a fast-acting toxin into his ear. The hit squad was caught red-handed by Jordanian security, and King Hussein was furious, as you can imagine. To secure the agent's release and calm tempers in Jordan, Israel was forced to provide an antidote that saved Mashal's life and also release Hamas's spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, from prison. The bungled operation badly damaged their relations with Jordan, as expected, a country which had a peace treaty with Israel. It was also a major embarrassment to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Who's Netanyahu? To his government, and domestically led to the resignation of Mossad chief Danny Yatom in 1998. In another incident in 1998, two Mossad operatives were arrested in Cyprus on espionage charges, and they were held for months before a plea bargain resulted in their release. The accumulation of such incidents in friendly countries gave Mossad a public black eye and raised questions about its accountability. Indeed, at the time, the Parliament or Congress of Israel started to found subcommittees to kind of establish and exercise some oversight over Mossad's activities, a response to the growing feeling in Israel that Mossad was acting too autonomously under the Prime Minister. Mossad still notched some successes in this period, though. It aided in security for Israeli embassies and Jewish communities after deadly bombings. The 1992 Israeli embassy attack, for example, and the 1994 Amia Jewish Center bombing by Iranian-backed Hezbollah. In 1996, Mossad helped uncover and thwart plans on Israeli targets in Central Asia and Europe through close. And additionally, Mossad played a kind of central role in the extradition of Carlos the Jackal, Ilik Ramirez Sanchez, tipping off French agents to his whereabouts in Sudan in 1994, which led to his capture. Perhaps one of the most far-reaching Mossad operations was Project Mega in the 90s, a highly secretive signals intelligence effort in partnership with the NSA aimed at monitoring Iran and other adversaries. Coming into the 2000s, and obviously off the back of September 11, Israeli intelligence saw closer cooperation with the United States. Notably, in August of 2001, Mossad had warned the FBI that as many as 200 terrorists were infiltrating the US and planning a major assault, even cautioning that a large-scale target was likely and Americans were vulnerable. However, the warning lacked specifics, such as the use of airplanes as missiles, and thus did not prevent 9/11. In the 2000s, Mossad actively provided intelligence to allies about Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah plots, and it helped track Al-Qaeda cells in East Africa and reportedly tipped off Indian intelligence about planned attacks. Domestically, Mossad analysts lent support to Shin Bet and Amman in confronting the Second Intifada in 2000 to 2005 by profiling terrorist networks and facilitating the targeted killing of militant leaders in the West Bank and Gaza, mostly via the IDF. Mossad's mandate, much like MI6 and the CIA, though, is to focus on overseas foreign operations, though. So while Shin Bet handled the Intifada internally, Mossad pursued Hamas and Hezbollah operatives abroad. One example was the 2004 assassination of Izz ad-Din Subi Sheikh Khalil, a Hamas official who was killed by a car bomb in Damascus, widely attributed to Mossad. And in 2008, Mohammed Suleiman, a top Syrian general and liaison for Iran, was shot by a sniper at a beach in Tartus. And many sources allege that Mossad had a very central hand in that killing as well. Throughout the 2000s, a number of Hezbollah cadres met similar fates with car bombs or mysterious explosions in Lebanon, and Syria thinned the ranks of those believed to be orchestrating attacks on Israel. Lebanese media reported numerous accidents befalling Hezbollah fighters or supporters or suppliers, and events were quietly credited to Mossad. As Iran's nuclear program became Israel's top security concern, Mossad undertook a shadow war to stall Iran's nuclear progress. Under directors Meir Dagan from 2002 to 2010 and Tamir Pardo, Mossad carried out a series of sabotage operations and targeted assassinations between 2010 and 2012. Between 2010 and 2012, at least 5 Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated, killed by magnetic bombs on cars or drive-by assassinations. Among them were Majid Shariari, which I'm definitely pronouncing wrong, and even more pronouncing wrong is Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan, both of which were killed by bombs in 2010 and 2012 respectively. While Israel neither confirmed nor denied involvement officially, the coordinated pattern led many to conclude these were hits by Mossad, given their history, background, and so on. And in one case, an attempted bombing in 2010 injured another scientist but failed to kill him. Beyond assassinations, though, Mossad famously were thought to have waged much cyber warfare during this period. It likely collaborated with the CIA to deploy the Stuxnet virus, which disrupted Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment facility around 2010 and was widely reported in a very famous incident at the time. A highlight of Mossad's Iran campaign was the theft of Iran's secret nuclear archive in 2018 in January. In a Hollywood-style overnight mission, Mossad agents broke into a secured warehouse in Tehran and smuggled out over 100,000 documents and computer files about Iran's past nuclear weapon planning. The trove, later publicly revealed by Israel's PM, proved that Iran had worked on a nuclear bomb design in Project Ahmad, and Israel shared these findings with US and European intelligence agencies. The operation was a bold success and gave much prestige among the intelligence community to the Mossad operation. In the 2000s, Mossad also deepened clandestine ties with moderate Arab states, alarmed by Iran and Islamist extremists. For instance, it quietly cooperated with Gulf states like the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, sharing intelligence on Iranian activities and Al-Qaeda. By 2018, these behind-the-scenes links helped pave the way for open diplomatic breakthroughs like the Abraham Accord, which will come later in 2020. Technologically, Mossad embraced brand new tools and jumped light years ahead of a lot of its counterparts. It had a dedicated cyber operations unit and recruited talent through unorthodox methods, famously planting a sophisticated puzzle on a public website in 2016 to attract cyber-savvy applicants. Surveillance techniques also massively advanced. In 2010, after Hamas weapons procurer Mahmoud al-Mabhouh was assassinated in Dubai, the world saw CCTV footage of a 26-agent team using wigs, tennis outfits, and cloned passports from multiple countries carrying out the hit. Dubai's police accused Mossad outright. And the assassins had traveled on British, Irish, God damn it, and French, Australian, and German passports, some identities of which were stolen from real dual citizens in Israel. The incident caused diplomatic uproar, with Britain, Ireland, Australia, and others expelling Israeli diplomats in protest over this. While Israel never admitted responsibility for the killing, it strengthened the impression that the Mossad operatives freely crossed borders under false identities and strained relations with allies. In 2007, though, Mossad became pivotal in the center of another major event: the discovery and destruction of Syria's covert nuclear reactor. Acting on Mossad gathered intelligence, which included stealing data from a Syrian official's laptop, Israel identified a reactor being built at Al-Kibar in eastern Syria. Mossad's finding was so convincing that in September of 2007, Israeli jets struck and destroyed the reactor in Operation Orchard before it could even become operational. The covert strike removed a grave potential threat and was later even acknowledged by Israeli leaders that it had gone on. Jumping forward to 2020, Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was killed in a remarkably sophisticated hit. Shot by a remotely operated machine gun which was mounted on a pickup truck that was controlled via satellite. Reports indicated no agents were physically present, and the automated gun, possibly using AI to aim, fired 15 rounds and then self-destructed. Iranian officials squarely blamed Israel, and later Western reporting credited Mossad as well for the ingenious assassination method. Meanwhile, Mossad also kept pressure on Iran's regional proxies. A number of IRGC Quds force operatives and arms smugglers mysteriously died in Lebanon, Syria, and even as far as Africa. And in 2019 and 2020, a series of blasts struck Iran's ballistic missiles and research sites. For example, the explosion on Natanz in July 2020, which intelligence sources quietly attributed to Israeli espionage. By this period, Mossad was effectively waging a low-intensity, clandestine war to slow Iran's military projects, a strategy largely condoned by the West as an alternative to open conflict. With ISIS on the rise in 2010, Mossad devoted resources to counter-jihadist intelligence as well. It reportedly assisted European services to track ISIS cells and helped foil plots targeting Jewish communities abroad. In one publicized incident, Israel's intelligence provided an advanced warning to Australia in 2017 about an ISIS plot to bomb an Etihad airliner, thereby preventing the attack. A rare case where Mossad's contribution was openly acknowledged by foreign leaders. And that kind of opens up what happened in the 2010s as well, where the Mossad directors kind of acted as quasi-diplomats throughout this area, dispatching, for example, Yossi Cohen, the director at the time, on secret visits to states with no official relations with Israel, reportedly meeting heads of states in the Gulf, Africa, and elsewhere to build covert partnerships throughout these regions. For example, Mossad is believed to have brokered understandings with Gulf monarchies over sharing early warnings of Iranian threats. Unofficial Mossad visits to Saudi Arabia and the UAE were reported by the media as precedents to eventually kind of normalize these deals. In 2018, Aziz Asbar, a Syrian rocket scientist, died in a car bombing widely thought to be a Mossad hit to impede Syria's missile program. These incidents constantly get talked about, obviously, as maybe an overstep. And I guess something we hear more and more about, you know, CIA interventions and so on. But I think the difference is Mossad kind of continue to operate in this way. And I guess the CIA do as well, and MI6 do as well, for example. They definitely do. We kind of know they do. But I guess it's more openly accepted that Mossad is going to do these things, whereas the CIA has to be a lot more careful now as the scrutiny of, you know, the Iran-backed overthrowing of the Shah and so on, very much made the CIA go, right, let's tamper down how much gets out from these. situations. One remarkable Mossad operation came to light in 2024. One of the craziest ones, though, was Operation Grim Beeper, which happened recently in 2024, right? Or 2025, where Mossad had basically allegedly at least, created a fake supply chain involving shell companies and fabricated licensing deals with a Taiwanese brand called Gold Apollo. Hezbollah believed they were importing legitimate pagers and radios, unaware that they were modified with explosive devices. Fake YouTube ads, brochures, and testimonials promoted the devices for their reliability, long battery life, and dust-proof casing, making them attractive to Hezbollah. This had gone on for 10 years over the previous decade, essentially. And on September 17th of 2024, yep, it was, the pagers admitted an urgent-sounding beep message sounding like you have an encrypted message, prompting users to activate them, which then detonated the devices at 3:30 p.m. Lebanese time in their hands. A second wave of explosions targeted the walkie-talkie devices the following day. This killed at least 42, unfortunately, including children and civilians, and around 3,000 to 3,500 civilians were injured. I mean, this is one of those things where, this is the problem with covering stuff like this in my mind, which is that, it's always interesting to cover like CIA and MI6 stuff and obviously Mossad stuff as well. Like, it is interesting from just a spy novel-esque point of, counterintelligence and espionage is interesting. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, these espionage agencies are the ones that least care about civilians constantly. And, you get Israel and local forces and so on touting the pager attack. And it sounds genius. You're like, oh, wow, like, that's a great way to take out enemies that like should reduce civilian casualties. But unfortunately, it never really does. And it's the same with like overthrowing regimes. It's like, oh, we got to get this regime out. And then you find out, well, you've just overthrown that regime. And now the new regime is even worse for the civilians, even though maybe it helps you for a short space of time. So let's pass that now and go on to the bit that you've all been waiting for, the links to Jeffrey Epstein. Obviously, just pointing out, a lot of this is rumor and so on, but this has been a major talking point recently, and I wanted to cover it. So let's jump into it. The Mossad links to Jeffrey Epstein. So one of the most sensational rumors involving Mossad in recent years centers around the late American financier and offender. I'm not going to say the word, offender of children, Jeffrey Epstein. This is YouTube, so I have to be a little bit more careful. And whether he may have been backed by or connected to intelligence services, including Israel's. And it must be stressed that obviously no conclusive evidence has confirmed this going forward. So take this as obviously grain of salt and just something of interest. But all of this kind of comes out after, in 2007, Alex Acosta, who was the Attorney General at the time, I think, basically said that he had to go lightly on Epstein as he belonged to intelligence. A lot of people always assume this meant CIA, FBI, NSA, whatever it may be. But lately, it's been constantly going back and forth to the Mossad. So let's jump into it. Epstein, who was arrested in 2019 on federal charges of trafficking of minors and died in jail, and allegedly ran a clandestine blackmail scheme. This is central to the kind of conspiracy around Jeffrey. Investigative journalists pursuing the Epstein story have posited that his inexplicable wealth and immunity might be explained if he was an intelligence asset. In late 2019, authors Dylan Howard and Melissa Cronin, as well as James Pattison, published Epstein, Dead Men Tell No Tales, which explicitly claims Epstein had ties to the Mossad. They cite the testimony of Ari Ben Menashe, a former Israeli intelligence officer who stated on the record that Epstein was recruited to work for Israeli intelligence. According to Ben Menashe, Epstein, with his partner Ghislaine Maxwell, ran a classic honey trap operation, luring VIPs into compromising situations, secretly recording their encounters with minors, and then supplying the incriminating material to the Mossad for blackmail purposes. Ben Menashe further claims that Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father, a British media tycoon and someone we're definitely going to cover on this channel at some point, had originally been running such an operation and essentially passed the torch to Epstein in the early 90s. In fact, Robert Maxwell's mysterious death in 1991 after falling from his yacht kind of alludes to rumors that his feelings with the Mossad and his engagings with the Mossad started to sour. Maxwell was accorded a state funeral in Israel and buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, with a funeral attended by a who's who of Israel's intelligence elite, and even the then Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, praising Maxwell's valuable connections to Israel. The extraordinary send-off fueled the belief that Maxwell was indeed a Mossad agent. Thus, the idea that his daughter and her boyfriend Epstein might also be involved with Mossad gained traction. Those who subscribe to the Epstein-Mossad theory point to several pieces of circumstantial evidence. For example, Epstein's penchant for installing secret cameras throughout his properties. Literally every room in his mansion had surveillance cameras feeding to a private security room with recording equipment. This aligns with the intelligence gathering operation, and Epstein, who amassed a fortune and operated with impunity for decades, causes conspiracy theorists to argue this must be some sort of official protection. Alexander Acosta, the US attorney, gave Epstein a lenient plea deal in 2007 and reportedly later told colleagues that Epstein belonged to intelligence and that he'd been told to back off. And this claim was reported in the Daily Beast in 2019 and cited in the aforementioned book. Epstein maintained his friendship with prominent Israeli figures such as Ehud Barak, a former prime minister and head of military intelligence, whom he funded in a tech venture. A connection that, while not proof of anything nefarious, raises a lot of eyebrows, as you can imagine. Barak was photographed visiting Epstein's New York townhouse on several occasions, although he insists this was for a legitimate business, he never met any girls, and so on and so forth. Mainstream journalists, though, have explored these rumors cautiously. Julie K. Brown, the Miami Herald reporter whose work led to Epstein's 2019 arrest, said it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Epstein had connections to Israeli intelligence and that such angles are not that far-fetched and need to be explored. And in a 2021 interview, Brown noted that striking parallels between Epstein's death in custody and Robert Maxwell's demise suggest that both cases leave a lot of questions to be answered and a lot to be desired. The Times of Israel likewise ran an interview with Brown, headlined "A Rumored Mossad Link is Worth Digging Into." Brown emphasized that while nothing is proven, the Mossad's link makes some sense given Epstein's close relationship with the Maxwell family, and the history of intelligence agencies to run blackmail operations, especially during the CIA Cold War era use of compromat. Another element often cited in the account of Ari Ben Menashe is his own memoirs and interviews. Menashe, who claimed to have been Robert Maxwell's handler in the 1980s, has consistently said that Ghislaine Maxwell worked for her father's Mossad ring and that Epstein was recruited as part of that operation in the late 80s. He described Epstein as an idiot who nonetheless was useful in procuring girls for powerful men who could then be used to trade in the dirt with various intelligence agencies, not just the Mossad. Basically, he said that he used his access to trap the rich and famous and traded the dirt he had on them to the world's most secretive intelligence agencies, including Israel's. Important to note, though, that Israel's government has flatly denied that Ben Menashe ever worked for the Mossad, which casts some doubt on his credibility. Nonetheless, his assertions from a core part of the Epstein-Mossad narrative were heavily featured in the book and media coverage. Unlike Epstein, though, Robert Maxwell's ties to Mossad are supported by considerable evidence. Aside from his state funeral and Shamir's eulogy, it was revealed in the 1980s Maxwell's companies had helped Israel obtain a bugged version of sensitive US software known as Promise, covered in the Octopus Murders documentary, which Mossad had then sold to foreign governments to spy on them. So it's very well known that Robert Maxwell was, or at least had very close dealings with Mossad, if not a Mossad agent himself, which then gives credibility and context to the idea that Ghislaine Maxwell would have been linked to the Mossad, and therefore the ties between Mossad and Epstein very much kind of come in to more and more credibility. There's been no official documents that link this, but it's an interesting one. And I mean, look, given what the Mossad and CIA and so on have done over the years, is it out of the realms of possibility? No. Given a lot of the inconsistencies, which we covered on the recent episode of the Jason Hassett Show about Epstein himself, is it unthinkable? Absolutely not. But let me know what you think. What I love to do in these episodes is dive into these details, give some of my opinions, but very much this is kind of like, look, there's a lot of topics that we all talk about, that we all think we know a good bit about, that I think we don't really deep dive into. And that is very much the point of the Jason Hassett Show. And hopefully you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please let me know by heading down to the comments and giving your feedback. And while you're down there, please do like and subscribe. And I'll see you next week for another episode of The Jason Hassett Show. Thank you so much.